Joining us now is Neysun Mahboubi. He's a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. A lot to get here, Neysun. First, I want to get your reaction to China's latest move to match the United States lawmakers Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz among those sanctions. And as you heard Nathan mention, the arrest of Jimmy Lai. So I just want to get your thoughts on all of these moving parts here just regarding Hong Kong.
Sure. First, regarding the sanctions, I was on the other day and I mentioned that the sanctions that the U.S. government imposed on Hong Kong officials on Friday were relatively calibrated and, in fact, in many ways symbolic because many of those officials are unlikely to have real assets in the United States. I think the corollary sanctions that the Chinese government has imposed on some U.S. congresspeople, senators, some heads of these different National Endowment of Democracy, Freedom House, all of those, they're similarly calibrated. They're calibrated, they're symbolic, but it's unlikely that any of these people on the U.S. side have assets in China. So in that sense, I think there's almost like a kabuki theater quality to the levying of sanctions on the Chinese side and the U.S. side. I do think that the arrest of Jimmy Lai is a big deal. That's a step that is going to resonate very much in the U.S. discourse about Hong Kong and China more broadly. And so I do think that that has real significance to it beyond the kabuki theater of the tit-for-tat sanctions.
Well, now to add to that, we have this other hot-button issue of Taiwan and this visit by the U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary. What would you say is behind that trip as the United States leads the world in the number of COVID cases?
Well, first of all, I do think those are two separate things. Taiwan has done quite well in terms of combating the COVID crisis. So if Secretary Azar has occasion to talk to Taiwanese officials about their success in that regard, that's great. But in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, this is something that I think can be understood to be somewhat calibrated as well. It is a step beyond sort of where things were before. But on the other hand, the Chinese have been taking steps beyond where they were before vis-a-vis Taiwan as well. So in that sense, both sides have moved the ball a bit, but I think if this was the only issue we were talking about, we could say that the overall picture is not so different from what it was before. The real sort of drama of it comes from it being embedded with all these other things that are going on that were just listed by Nathan before I came on.
Right. It's hard to keep up these days. Tech troubles as well, front and center. We saw President Trump's executive orders just a few days ago on both TikTok and WeChat. And now you have America's biggest tech companies drawn into this fight as well.
Yeah, you know, the TikTok and the WeChat, I think they're different apps and they relate to different kinds of issues. You know, some people have suggested that teenagers will be angry if they lose TikTok, and that may well be the case, but that's not really going to affect the election because teenagers can't vote. WeChat, I think that is interesting because there are many Chinese Americans, many of them conservative, and in fact Trump voters who use WeChat to communicate and in fact mobilize politically on behalf of President Trump. So there's some irony there. But I think the broader significance of the WeChat ban is simply whether you want to have more communication between Americans and Chinese in the U.S. versus not having that communication. And of course that in itself is qualified by the fact that many analogous U.S. apps to WeChat are banned in China. So, you know, there is also a sense of equilibrium there as well. If Facebook and Google and Twitter are banned in China, then why shouldn't WeChat be banned in the U.S.?
So, Neysun, really about 30 seconds left. We're out of time, but I got to ask you, is there a point in the coming weeks and days where you're going to look at this and say, hey, this relationship is in trouble, in real trouble?
You know, I tend to be an optimist by nature, and I still remain relatively optimistic. And it's not just because I'm an optimist by nature. I think concretely the reasons are these. One, on the whole, the U.S. and China share more common interests, I believe, than disagreements. And their disagreements are real and sharp and growing. But at the end of the day, both countries are still invested in a stable global order. And there's lots of issues, including COVID, including the climate, including the environment in which the two countries can cooperate. So ultimately, I still tend to be optimistic, but of course, this is a very tempestuous time. There's no question about that.
All right, Neysun Mahboubi, always great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Elaine.